for a moment. So I will introduce our speaker for today. I'm really excited about this talk. Anybody who follows me on Twitter will have seen this. So I am introducing Clarence Joldersma, who is a professor of education at Calvin University, where he's taught for over 25 years. But before that, he was a high school science teacher. His scholarship is often at the intersection of disciplines, including philosophy, mind, neuroscience, and education. He has published 4 books, including Neuroscience and Education, a philosophical appraisal. Among his more than 70 articles and book chapters of interest, for this audience in particular, include philosophical questions and opportunities at the intersection of neuroscience, education, and research. And also he's co-authored a chapter with our very own Jo van Herwegen from UCL, a chapter which is Context of Educational Neuroscience in the book Education and Context in Reimagining Education. Today, he's going to be talking to us about his enactive account of cognition based on his experience in a carpenter's woodshop. So I won't tell you too much more because I'm going to hand over now to Clarence, who's going to tell us all about that. So over to you, Clarence, to go ahead and share your screen, and I will mute myself and turn off my camera.
Okay, I'll share my screen and then start talking. Let's see. This is what I want.
Oh, sorry, Clarence, while you're doing that, I forgot to say one thing. Ordinarily, people tend to just stay silent and then ask questions in the chat at the end or put their hand up. Are you happy with that?
That sounds good. And if I miss some, then you'll direct me to them.
I will. Okay, thanks.
Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen here.
Yes.
The handiness of hands, enactive cognition in the woodshop. So I'm really excited about this talk, and thank you for inviting me to do so. I'm also a bit nervous because I'm a philosopher of education, not an empirical scientist. Although, as was mentioned, as Rebecca mentioned, an undergraduate degree in science and a high school science teacher. That was a long time ago, though. My scholarship includes philosophical explorations at the intersection of philosophy of mind, neuroscience, and learning or cognition. And as the title indicates, I also have a background in carpentry in one of my former lives. So in this presentation, I combine those interests. So my goal is to explore an enactive account of cognition as it emerges from my experience in the woodshop. In particular, I'm interested in exploring the role of the hand in cognition. The presentation builds on an essay I published in 2019 where I developed an enactive account of learning. Using a picture of my grandson playing with a toy train that I built for him one Christmas, I argued that learning is not isolated in the mind or brain, but involves interactions that couple mind, brain, body, and world. If you look at his hands, you'll see, right, he's picking up a wooden disc. One hand is holding another, and he's very skillful at this. It shows very handiness of hands. Enactive cognition follows what Sean Gallagher, following Sean Gallagher's, I look at it as action-oriented, that action orientation shapes most cognitive processes. So I explore this by describing the cognition of handiness as improvisational adjustments to what is afforded by woodshop practices. I'll use several examples from my own woodshop, informally my enactive cognition lab, centering on tool use. Some will be first-person accounts using a tool, say when I built the toy train. Others will be third-person accounts of tool use by my son and grandson when they made a set of canoe paddles, or when we made a set of canoe paddles. I also volunteer at a local nonprofit called Home Repair Services. They provide kitchen cabinets at cost price provided by volunteers for socioeconomically disadvantaged homeowners. A few years ago, I taught a university course in their woodshop titled Doing Justice in the City, One Kitchen Cabinet at a Time. The woodshop was my informal and active classroom, one could say. My students in that course learned to assemble kitchen cabinets. Most had no previous building skills, yet they built an entire set of kitchen cabinets and then installed them in a house designated for a low-income household. I also use examples of their tool use to illustrate how the hand enacts cognitive processes. So let's first look at the hand in general. What's so special about the hand? What makes it so handy? Many philosophers argue that humans occupy a special place in the natural world, often noting that our cognition, say our reasoning or thinking, is what makes us unique. Excuse me. For example, Martin Heidegger argues for the hand's uniqueness in conjunction with thinking. He writes, "The hand is a peculiar thing. In the common view, the hand is part of our bodily organism, but the hand's essence can never be determined or explained by being an organ which can grasp. Apes, too, have organs that can grasp, but they do not have hands. The hand is infinitely different from all grasping organs, paws, claws, or fangs, different by an abyss of essence. Only a being who can speak, that is, think, can have hands and be handy in achieving the works of handicraft." So, for Heidegger, our hands reveal our cognition. Quote, again, "Every motion of the hand in every one of its works carries itself through the element of thinking. Every bearing of the hand bears itself in that element. All the works of the hand is rooted in thinking." Unquote. The hand exhibits the central way that humans are different, in essence, from non-human creatures, according to him. At first glance, Heidegger's claims seem obvious. Human hands seem capable of many more things than those of other creatures, even other primates: gesturing, painting, carving, piano playing, writing, building, and more. This seems obviously the result of our superior cognition. His claim is not only that the human hand is uniquely dexterous, but also that its dexterity reveals our rationality. Heidegger claims that our hands are a sign of our thinking. It is this that marks our uniqueness as humans, in our very embodiment. But is the human hand unique among animals, as Heidegger claims? Is the human hand really an expression of humans as thinking, language using rational creatures? Or is there a different way of thinking about this? Hand scholars argue that the human hand is a variation of a general structure found in many mammals and other creatures. More pointedly, they suggest that the human hand is actually more primitive than, for example, most other mammals, including primates. To call the hand primitive is to say that its organizational plan does not depart significantly from early mammalian archetypes of the forelimb. Whereas in other mammals, the structure evolved into specific and specialized organs, such as hooves or claws. In primates, their current anatomy preserves primitive basic structures and neuromotor patterns. Interestingly, these primitive qualities are what gives primate hands, quote, greater prehension, dexterity, and neural control compared to most other mammals, unquote. And among primates, the human hand is arguably the most primitive. This puts at least a small dent in Heidegger's claims. The hand, of course, can't be understood without situating it in the whole body evolutionary development. Permanent upright posture has affected many bodily features, including not only the foot, knee, and hip, which are directly involved in bipedal locomotion, but also vertebral column, shoulders and arms, as well as skull and face. Upright posture recalibrates how the world is experienced and engaged. And it is in this context that the human hand, attached as it is to arms and shoulders, emerges in its abilities and possibilities. The hand's abilities, often grouped around prehensile and non-prehensile movements, are the basis of an exceedingly rich variety of hand actions. The thumb, index, and middle finger can form a three-jaw chuck, which can grasp irregular shapes such as stones, pencils, or nails. The ability to oppose all the fingers with the thumb creates a firm palm grip on, say, hammer handles or tennis rackets. This great versatility shapes the hand's pragmatic engagements with the world, on which our practical sense-making depends. Human hands have a greater mobility with movement of rotation, flexion, and extension at the level of the wrist and the digits. Humans capitalize on this difference by not only using the hand to grasp, but to produce limitless fine motor movements. It is the hand's lack of specialization, its primitiveness, that makes it so flexible. When the hand manipulates a screwdriver to loosen some wires, or when it turns over something unusual to examine the thing more closely, as my sons are doing here, the hand's continuous and changing positions are, quote, choreographed to achieve a continuous and integrated solution to the biomechanical and neurophysiological constraints of any movement. The hand's handiness occurs within the constraints set up by the limits of opposing muscular forces and the limits of innervation and signaling to the hand's muscle fibers. Although Heidegger was right to note the hand's extreme versatility in movement and action, this is a function of its primitive character. Perhaps human intelligence is tied to the primitiveness of the human hand. Our hand movements require continuous information about a multitude of things, including location in space, forces of action, motions of various digits, all, of course, in relation to arms and shoulders, not to say torso and legs. Take, for example, my student using a drill press. She's steadily pulling a lever to lower a drill bit as she cuts a hinge pocket in a cabinet door. The flow of information required for continual adjustment of her hand's pulling action is enacted by a rich variety of touch sensors. Meissner corpuscles detect microslippages of the hand in its grip, enacting the student's ability to make continuous adjustments to gripping the lever as it rotates to push the bit into the wood. Ruffini corpuscles detect horizontal stretching of the hand's skin, giving feedback about her hand's shape in its conformity to the drill's handle. Merkel cells detect edges, form, and texture, continuously supplying information about the handle's shape, etc., as in its resistance during the downward stroke. And finally, Pacinian corpuscles detect high-frequency vibrations from the interface between the drill bit and the wood, giving information about the drill at the wood interface. Together, these touch sensors supply feedback information, which are synthesized to choreograph the continuous drilling action, integrating the student's hand movements within its biomechanical and neurophysiological constraints. These continuous feedback loops are central to her handiness. Our hand actions are, of course, closely connected to our brain, which plays a central role in interactions with the world. The felt experience of drilling is supported by a complex set of sensory neurons, with signals flowing through a variety of neural pathways and undergoing convergent integrations. Sensors in the skin, muscle, and tendons send continuous stream of signals to the brain, triggered by movements and position changes, proprioception. There are feedback loops through spinal ganglia to brain centers, including basal ganglia, the cerebellum, and the thalamus. Signals are relayed to several cerebral centers, such as the primary and secondary somatosensory cortices, as well as the mid-parietal and the posterior parietal cortices. These all support the hand anticipating, executing, fine-tuning its movements in real time. Gallagher notes, quote, "The brain partners with the hand and forms a functional unit that properly engages with the agent's environment. Neural processes coordinate with and can be entrained by the hand's movement, forming a single integrated cognitive system." Part 2. The hand does not normally perceive objective properties of things. Rather, the things in the woodshop are experienced in terms of their significance for an interested subject, something J.J. Gibson calls affordances. Rather than objective properties, affordances are, quote, directly perceivable environmental opportunities for behavior, unquote. Affordances are relationships, quote, by virtue of the orientation they have to our moving and perceiving bodies, unquote. They are relationships between the abilities of the active subject and the solicitations of behavior embedded in the world. So in my workshop, I attend to what things offer me for undertaking my projects. So on the one hand, this depends on my carpentry abilities, but on the other hand, this depends on the woodshop's normative practices. For example, I recently built a set of movable display shelves for a friend. My drill press, with a suitable jig built for that project, constituted a set of affordances, namely possibilities for drilling holes at regular intervals and vertical sides that will hold movable pegs that support the shelves. This setup constituted the availability of the woodshop's useful things for my skilled actions of drilling evenly spaced holes. Its affordances solicited my continuously changing hand movements of pulling down the drill pulling down the drill press's handle, while pushing the shelves vertical sides against the jig's peg, all in the social context of building a set of display shelves that would help my friend display and sell her paintings. Hands are central to my skillful actions in the woodshop. Hence, handles of my tools constitute a set of relevant affordances. A power tool's handle is an invitation for my hand to enclose around it. A horizontal platform, an invitation to rest something on it. So for example, my Orbital Sander circular handle invites an open grip with fingers spaced evenly and curled underneath. By contrast, my power drill's handle invites a closed grip with fingers touching each other while putting the index finger on the trigger. The working surface of my bandsaw invites me to rest wood on its platform to allow for pushing the wood against the saw teeth of the moving vertical blade. Each thing in my woodshop solicits specific interactions. It is as if each tool pulls a specific action out of me. This is an offer-response relationship, a dynamic that constitutes sensory-motor engagements, which we could call, paraphrasing Heidegger, being in the woodshop, one word. The affordances that solicit my actions are not isolated, independent of each other, but are situated in a field Gallagher calls an affordance space. An affordance space is an area of possibilities defined not only by my anatomy and abilities, arms of a certain length, hands of a certain shape, but also by cultural practices such as sawing or drilling and normative constraints of the woodshop projects. My hands help define an affordance space as that reachable parapersonal space around my body that has significance for accomplishing tasks. Tools can expand my affordance space, not only by extending my physical reach, but also by expanding my possible actions. One project in my woodshop was building a set of canoe paddles for a school trip. My grandson had volunteered my expertise to make them, and he was part of our building team, including sanding them smooth. His grip on the Orbital Sander emerged from his set of anatomical features and motor skills responding to the solicitations of the sander, its affordances. His fingers are gently curved around the handle, spread apart comfortably to get the best grip of its circumference. His palm resting firmly on the top of the sander for more control as it spins. His hand is engaged in rhythmic motions afforded by the sander, moving it around the surface to smoothen the canoe paddle evenly. As he guides the tool around the paddle surface, he continually adjusts his posture, his head angle, his hand grip, so that the sander's movements remain converged on a stable rhythmic motion. Another example. A group of students are assembling a kitchen cabinet. Here too, the various wood pieces are experienced not as objective properties, but as relevant affordances that invite behavioral opportunities. A simple jig affords holding the sides vertically, the right distance apart. The slots cut into the two sides are experienced as handy, affording the students to insert the top and the bottom. Watch. As we see the offer response of affordances in action, we see one student using a prehensile precision grip to insert the board into a slot, followed by a prehensile power grip to push it down using her body for extra force, followed by a non-prehensile hammering motion, ending with a pushing motion. The other student uses a combination of power grip with her right hand and precision grip with her left hand, followed by a whole body pushing motion and finishing with a hammering motion as well. This sequence of motions are responses to relevant affordances and the goal of a well-seated bottom and top. The pieces of wood invite them to bring appropriate actions based on the handy skills they have recently developed. These relevant affordances stand out from a rich affordance field situated in the form of life called the woodshop, where skilled individuals engage in cultural practices of cabinet assembly. Part 3. Gallagher suggests that a hand engaged in tool use, quote, reflects an intrinsic or inherent temporality. More than just timing, the hand's temporality involves an intrinsic past and future in the present. At any moment when using a tool, the immediate past and the immediate future is part of the present moment of action. The immediate present is experienced not only as something occurring presently, but also as having just done something, a retention, while also going somewhere, an anticipation. Like the temporality of a melody, this creates the action's arc at each moment. Using a saw or a sander or a drill is like singing happy birthday. Maybe you notice that's what this little song is about, where the recurrent part of a movement is like the current note in that melody, always situated in an immediate retention and in an immediate anticipation. Gallagher points to 3 important time scales involved in temporal activity: elementary scales, which are around 10 to 100 milliseconds, integrative scales, which are around half to 3 seconds, and narrative scales, which are anything above 3 seconds. Neural activity of the hand's action typically occurs at the elementary time scale. Hand sensors send signals to the brain, which send signals to the flexors and extensors and so forth. Movement on this scale is faster than we can consciously experience because it follows the faster dorsal pathway that serves the hand's motor control. Hand adjustments within the elementary time scale respond to visual information in the dorsal stream, shaping the fingers in response to the movement's anticipated immediate trajectory. Now, elementary scale activity is experienced indirectly as part of the slower integrative scale. Activity on the integrative scale is typically experienced as our lived present, something occurring now, say a 1 to 3 second duration. As noted earlier, an occurrent experience includes retentions of immediate pasts and anticipations of immediate possibilities, like a melody. For example, my son is pushing a piece of wood through the bandsaw following a pre-drawn line to form the curve of a canoe paddle. He is visually tracking the saw blade on the pencil line as his hands push the wood forward. To be successful, his occurrent awareness is not only of the wood at the saw blade, but also on the spot just ahead of that, anticipating what is to be cut, while simultaneously retaining awareness of what the saw blade has just completed cutting. The success of the occurrent moment of the sawing action involves an anticipatory focus and a retention of the past on the integrative time scale. In the present moment, he is looking ahead to the immediately next moment of the cut, given what has just happened. Significantly, integrative timescales are normally nested in narrative timescales. The narrative scale activity, anything greater than 3 seconds, is experienced as time beyond the present, beyond the occurrent moment, including remembering things in the past and expecting things in the future. The narrative scale of a saw cut involves remembering that it is a canoe paddle being cut and expecting a finished paddle, situating the occurrent moment in a narrative meaning. The canoe paddle narrative involves being aware that these paddles are central characters in the narrative of my grandson volunteering my woodshop to cut 30 canoe paddles for his class and expecting that they will help fulfill the culminating part of the curriculum of his nature-centered school. The current moment is situated in a narrative scale of remembering and expecting. This reveals that affordances are themselves situated in meaningful projects that have social context. A toy train is an age-appropriate Christmas present for my grandson, or at least it was. Now he's 16. The affordances of the woodshop being used to construct the train, the bandsaw's flat surface and vertical blade, are situated in that narrative meaning. A bystander might innocently ask, "What are you doing?" I might answer, "Sawing a piece of maple," or "cutting the top of a caboose," or "building a toy train," or "making a Christmas present for my grandson." These answers are narrative meanings nested in each other. The broader answers provide meaning for the more particular answers, even as the immediate answers remain embedded in the broader ones. Making a Christmas present for my grandson provides the meaningful context for the significance of my pushing a piece of maple through the bandsaw at that particular time in that particular way. The affordances of the bandsaw are situated in meaning fields, making them meaningful affordances. Movements at the integrative timescale are thus experienced and situated normatively. At any moment, I might experience positively or negatively balanced judgments about my current action. Is my saw cut running from the pencil line? Is this variation too much? These are affectively charged normative judgments about excellence indexed to what matters. Mattering doesn't emerge at the integrative scale. The normativity of successful tool use appears at the narrative scale. Saying that skillful tool use has a normative orientation means that we use a tool in ways that matter. Successful use means something is at stake in their usage. For example, the normativity involved in my using a bandsaw involves judgments of a better and worse usage in the context of experiencing my cuts as part of a project, say cutting angled sides to a toy train's coal car. The excellence of the cut is judged normatively in the context of the wooden piece as part of a rail car of a toy train for my grandson for a Christmas present. The precision of the angled line matters only in that narrative context. The excellence of the cut depends on its normative context, on how well it fits into the narrative network of significance. Another example, the narrative time scale frames how meaningful affordances are temporal, with shorter time frames nested in longer ones. In my month-long course, students learn various woodshop skills: stapling, screwing, gluing, drilling, hammering. The excellence of their basic skills are judged in a narrative context of learning how to build kitchen cabinets for a low-income home. As students' occurrent hand motions are embedded in the narrative memory and narrative expectations that their cabinet is part of a set of cabinets for a kitchen in a house being renovated with a nonprofit organization whose mission is to make available affordable housing for families in economically precarious situations. Present motions are embedded in a nested series of narrative meanings, which at their broadest, in this case, could be described as our month-long story of doing justice in the city, one kitchen cabinet at a time. Part 4. It is in this context that I developed the idea of improvisational handiness. By handiness, I mean the dexterity of hand use that emerges when someone is completing a task, such as assembling a kitchen cabinet or building a toy train or cutting a canoe paddle. Hand movements emerge as solutions to the task at hand. Handiness is not inside the person and then expressed, as Heidegger thought. Rather, Handiness emerges in the interaction with the woodshop environment between bodily skills and relevant affordances. Improvisation describes the manner of such handiness. Improvisations are real-time dynamic changes that occur during embodied interaction with the world, when desired tasks are being completed. My grandson's emerging piano playing involves improvising finger placement, timing, and force. Improvising names our temporal way of being bodily in the world, one word, namely our contingent response to anticipations of what is next in completing a task, situated in retentions of what we have just done. Bodily interactions of handiness need recurrent adjustments to continuously cope well with the world's cascading resistance. This is what I'm calling improvisational handiness. The improvisational freedom involved in skilled tool use means that our continuously adjusted motions are not merely a rule-governed or patterned series of regular movements, as if success was merely to follow the pattern or the rule. The mistake many novices make when using a tool for the first time is rigidly emulating an exact predetermined pattern of movements, as if following a rule. But skillful tool use is not rule-bound behavior. The handiness of everyday skills involves improvisationally enacting a range of possible responses to the relevant affordances. And this depends not only on our skill level, but also on the situation, including the normative orientation of narratively situated projects. For example, the embodied skillful activity of stapling is improvisational, enacting one of several possible options of movements in a way that matters. Skillful improvisations involve real-time adjustments. My son's cutting a paddle on the bandsaw requires making incremental adjustments to the force and angle of the wood as he moves it against the circulating blade. Continuously pushing the wood forward into the saw blade's path involves moment-by-moment contingent adjustments in response to the visual tracking of the arc of the cut, which itself involves moment-by-moment anticipations concerning the wood's trajectory, situated in how the cut has been progressing thus far. His hand's grip on the wood freely anticipates the force required in the slow turning motion, foreseeing the changes needed at any incremental moment of the cut's arc. Improvisation thus names an indeterminacy interactions. The repetitive to and fro movement of one's interactions with the world during tool use involves inherent contingencies. Affordances in the world are open to a variety of responses, allowing for more than one impossible action to the invitation to act. And in response to an initiating movement, the world pushes back, requiring improvised actions to move forward to meet those cascading resistances. The to and fro cycle between action and world repeats for the duration of the tool's use. The interaction between the activities undertaken and the affordances resistance require adjustments. When the action doesn't go quite as anticipated, it needs to be adjusted on the fly to adapt to that perceived changing circumstance, one that, quote, mobilizes strategies to keep the work happening, unquote. Previous commitments to a motion don't determine all the future possible motions. The to and fro dynamic means that the subject is always creating something new in real time. They are improvising. For example, installing kitchen cupboards is never merely mechanical or algorithmic, but involves improvisations based on normative judgments. Installing cabinets is, to apply Eric Rietveld's words, quote, continuously perturbed by possibilities for action that attract or repel it, unquote. As the installation moves from cupboard to cupboard, any one of them on the wall might sag out of line, or those on the floor might get too far off level because the floor is unexpectedly uneven, perturbing the expected course of the installation. This requires continual adjustment in real time on the fly. These adjustments are ongoing, affectively immersed, improvisational action, responding to monitoring what matters, namely level cupboards that are even and plumb so that the countertop will be level and thus enjoyably used by an eager family. Improvisational handiness is thus a response to the indeterminacy of the world's meaningful affordances, pointing to the contingency of our interactions. Handiness is successfully anticipating what needs to be done next because of the indeterminacies of our basic relations to the world. For example, sanding a curve on a canoe paddle on a benchtop sander shows improvisational handiness. My grandson moves the board in a curving motion against the disc sander, keeping the arc of motion on a smooth curve. As he moves his right hand forward and shifts his weight, his left hand acts as a fulcrum around which the curving motion turns, and he keeps his eyes fixed on the point of contact where the wood presses against the grit. These movements are responses to relevant affordances of the yellow sanding disc, resisting the wood's movement. He is continually adjusting the force so that the wood remains tight enough against the disc to smoothen it, but loose enough to not bind the sander or cause it to jerk the wood out of his hands. In successfully sanding a paddle, my grandson doesn't follow a set of predetermined sensory motor motions. Instead, he constantly adjusts over the course of the sanding movement. The various movements for different parts of the sweep point to his skillful improvisations that exploit the freedom of handiness. Improvisations are thus intrinsically temporal. The occurrent movement of sanding is experienced as continuing an immediately past moment while anticipating an immediately future possibility. Immediate retentions situate the contingent anticipations at this occurrent moment on the integrative timescale. The inherent temporality both opens up and limits the improvisational character of such handiness. And I'd like to highlight especially the anticipatory dimension of our improvisations. As a temporal pathway with an open and adjustable trajectory, the anticipated future movements require reference to the occurrent hand action situated in what has just happened. It is this anticipatory dimension of handiness that I think discloses the world as meaningful through revealing new possible affordances, soliciting the hand's further improvisational actions in its moving forward. When we look with a broader lens at an individual interacting with their changing environment, improvisational handiness reveals itself as a mode of adaptive self-regulation. This broader idea is that our actions in the world involve a continued striving to live, a global aim of continued existence and enjoyment in precarious conditions. At a whole organism level, our embodied subjectivity can be called a skillful body, something Eric Rietveld defines as, quote, a concernful system of possible actions, unquote. As the leading edge of our skillful bodies, improvisational handiness contributes a flexible repertoire of possible actions concerned with managing and enhancing our life's continuation while managing its precariousness. The term concernful highlights that improvisational handiness is not merely a practical or pragmatic notion, but is animated normatively. Our skillful improvisations are entrained by positive and negative valences that reveal what is at stake for our human flourishing, including not only practical actions, but also bodily enjoyment. Part 5. This case study of handiness is meant to illustrate the idea of an active cognition. In this understanding, cognitive structures and processes emerge from engaged interactions with the world. An active cognition is a whole organism accomplishment, emerging as a self-organizing tendency towards grip on the world in response to relevant affordances. Improvisational handiness is meant to make tangible and visible the processes of an active cognition. Heidegger was mistaken. Thinking does not occur in the interior somewhere and then get expressed in the hands. Rather, thinking itself is a form of action, perhaps first brought forth through the cognitive activity of improvisational handiness. The skillful body maintaining itself in a changing world shows up as tendencies towards gaining a better grip on the world. Doing so can be called skillful coping, This is cognition at work. Cognitive behavior as skillful coping can be illustrated in the emerging skill of stapling together two pieces of wood for a cabinet. The intelligence of the hand's action in the brain-body-hand stapler-wood coupling emerges with respect to the norms of excellence and situated meanings of the goals of the project. At first, the student can only staple straight down and can control the stapler adequately in this position. Over time, their hand actions settle more reliably on a dependable way of carrying out the task, given the goals of the project. Improvisational handiness as skillful coping is intelligent action. Through repeated experience of stapling, students acquire abilities to more finely discriminate novel situations. Better skills are more finely discriminated responses to the solicitations of the world. Skillfully coping means they more consistently meet the expected norm for stapling pieces together in the assembly process. The standard of excellence of stapling in this case is where staples don't protrude out of the side, because that's something that matters in cabinetry. Not always reaching the standard of excellence of the norm occurs because of the ambiguity of the affordances and the contingencies of improvisational abilities. Learning thus involves making improvements to the improvisational skills to meet normative standards for stapling actions in the narrative context of the woodshop projects of assembling kitchen cabinets. The student's improvisational handiness is thus a form of intelligence, where the woodshop practice of stapling meets the norms for the project's significance of building kitchen cabinets. The adaptive self-regulation that marks enactive cognition shows cognition to be a form of self-organization. My grandson got more skillful at cutting canoe paddles on the bandsaw as time progressed. I witnessed gradual and incremental changes in his sawing ability, and then at a certain point, a qualitatively new level of ability emerged. He was confidently cutting a smooth curve on the bandsaw. Through his repeated improvised interactions with the saw, wood, and pencil line, he became skillful at moving the wood so that the saw blade returned easily to the pencil line if at an immediately previous moment the saw blade was straying from that line. His awkwardness of motions, straying from the line, overcorrecting, moving to the other side too far, having the saw blade bind in the saw cut, disappeared at a certain point. A new skillful stability emerged in the sawing action. This skillful coping, experienced as the ability to adapt well to a changing dynamic of sawing, was self-organizing, emerging in the interactions between hand, wood, and saw. Cognition as adaptive self-organization shows up as agency, by which I mean the ability to act intentionally on one's own behalf in the world. Thus, by adaptive self-organization, I mean, quote, self-constructive in such a way as to regulate actively one's interactions with one's environment, unquote. The practical relation of handiness, or improvisational engagement with multiple affordances in the lived world, is a form of agency because it involves actively self-regulating our interactions relative to the goal at hand. That is, as bodily agents, we experience ourselves as subjects. Said differently, our active self-regulation is experienced as personal action readiness for engagement distributed over the mind, brain, body, world coupling, and oriented towards relevant affordances situated in an intended project. My grandson shows agency as he deliberately moves his hands to maneuver the wood against the sanding disc. His purposeful movements are self-constructive for the sake of actively regulating his responses to the woodshop's affordances. He was trying to improve previous attempts to make the edge smooth. His improvisational hand movements show his agency as risk-inflected regulations constituting his responses to possible pathways for sanding well. The self-regulation of his actions can be called enacted cognition, suggesting that cognition is a form of agency and agency is a form of cognition. John Gallagher suggests, quote, hand actions shape our cognitive processes, unquote. Intelligence is affordance-based, where graspable tools such as orbital sanders or power drills grab one's attention because they might enact cognitive possibilities. That is, our hands engagements enact intelligence. Handiness as part of our agency involves actions deliberately directed towards a particular object, something Gallagher calls enactive intentionality. The improvisational handiness of inserting a board into a pre-cut groove embodies an active intentionality because the inserting action is directed towards the goal of assembling the sides of the cabinet to its top and bottom. Such action is an active intentionality because it is acting on one's own behalf towards enacting an intended project. The bodily character of an active intentionality occurs through improvisational actions. Cognitive process involve intentional actions. As Gallagher puts it, these are, quote, a kind of ongoing dynamical adjustment in which the brain, as part of and along with the larger organism, settles into the right kind of attunement with the environment, unquote. Such intentional attunements, improvisational yet directed adjustments to the world, are, I think, interpretations. I act because I have a sense of how to proceed in the task at hand. The interpretational character of handiness shows the agent-initiated responses are aimed at settling into the right sort of attunement with the world. Settling into the right attunement, say, of assembling a kitchen cabinet, is deliberately initiating the right responses to the normative standards of completing a set of kitchen cabinets. Finally, in the end, I'd like to end by returning to Heidegger's claim that our handiness expresses prior thinking. I'm suggesting the reverse, that handiness is thinking. Thinking is a relational process between individual and world. This interaction produces understandings and values of the lived world. Gallagher says, quote, rationality is built into action insofar as we can think of reasoning as the ability to differentiate which affordances to respond to and how to go about responding to them, unquote. Handiness as thinking is embodied rationality. Handiness as thinking involves experiencing one's environment as a meaningful world. This is sense-making, which Thompson and Stapleton say is behavior or conduct in relation to environmental significance and balance, which the organism enacts or brings forth. Sense-making has a direction and horizon, radiating outward from the immediate improvisational handiness towards a larger array of meaningful affordances. Handiness is thus sense-making, the discriminating skillfulness of coping well with the possibilities afforded in the world, that is, making sense of the world. So perhaps, contra Heidegger, quote, whatever we can do in our heads has its origins in what we can do with our hands, unquote. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clarence. As you can see, I've moved rooms because my dogs did start being a pain. Thank you for that. We've got 2 questions already in the chat. I have one myself, and I don't know if anybody else does. You can put up your hand or put it in the chat. So the first one is from Gary that says, I'm wondering if this affordance is related equally to visual pathway dominance. Have any similar observations and affordances being noted in those who are blind who experience significant visual impairment?
That's a good question. I mean, I think if you think of the history of the idea of affordances, Gibson was interested in the visual array of, and so the examples of affordances often come to the interaction of visual and tactile hand. But certainly, it's not. I don't think affordances are modal specific or sensory specific. They cross sensory modes. I think they're more holistic in the sense than, and so lacking any one sense, like a person who's blind, doesn't mean that maybe a certain part of an affordance or a certain way of the world affords us is missing, but the world is still a set of affordances that are relevant to that person. I don't know if that answers the question.
Thank you. There's another from Michael. Is improvisational handiness solely a question of skill acquisition, or are there developmental changes? How different does it look in a 5-year-old compared to a 15-year-old?
Oh, yeah. I think definitely it develops over one's lifetime, starting from birth, or I don't know, maybe pre-birth. I don't know anything about pre-birth, but yeah, if you think of at least the little that I've read about early development in children, the directedness of hand movements. First, it might be spontaneous movements, but in interaction with a parent, let's say, or an older adult, I think hand movements become directed at, perhaps explored by itself, or perhaps watching others, and the interactions is with affordances. So grasping, touching, putting it in the mouth, are all about interacting with the world in these are all skills, I think, of some sort. It's explorations, but they're skills. They're not, so skills aren't the skills that I'm thinking of. I've used the woodshop example, but the skills I'm thinking of are as broad as our interactions in the world, lifelong, life-wide, let's say. So it'd be interesting to see, how these develop over time, right? The 5-year-old, the 2-year-old. In the sense, that's what I was trying to do with my my article about the train with my grandson, trying to say, so I think I don't know how old he is there, 2, maybe 2, 3, he's pretty young. And he isn't just physically learning how to pick up these things, he's interacting with them in meaningful ways and discovering fractions, I think. He knows how to count already, but he doesn't know fractions necessarily. And the train affords him to learn fractions by interacting with it. So as a 2-year-old, it's the affordances of the train give him those possibilities. At least that's what I was claiming in the article.
Thank you. And another question, how does this enactive system of thinking making, or embodied experience inform the creative potential of cognition, or advance a new form of creative thinking, in quotes?
Yeah, so maybe I'll go out on a limb here. At least my understanding of creative thinking, at least the stuff I've read about creative thinking, is that it doesn't happen all the time. It only happens sometimes. I'm trying to be creative here, and I'm not. Now I'm just being whatever, I don't know, regular thinking. But I don't think there is such a thing. So if I'm right about the improvisational character, then all thinking is creative to some degree, right? And now some may be following repeated lines that feels like following repeated lines, so it doesn't feel as creative. But I think that what we call creative thinking is really maybe a riskier outlying edge of what we always do, which is already creative thinking, because we're always improvising to some degree, because we're interacting with a world that pushes back against us in those, and affords us, but also pushes back. So I think in some ways, all thinking is creative thinking. And if you think of even this, I don't know if this has anything to do with it, but reading about memory. Memory isn't just drawing back what are snapshots of the past. We recreate those things, and as a result, they change. And I think that's the creative side that happens in memory. And I think the same thing happens in our everyday thinking and everyday actions.
Thank you. There's a question from Joe, and if there's time, I'm going to sneak my question in as well. But Joe's asked what you think the impact of the use of technology, like mobile phones, etc., has in terms of improvised handiness.
That's yeah. I don't know. So offhand, it seems to me that they have certain affordances, and they close down other affordances. So all of us, if we're over, I don't know, 40, we probably remember the switch from writing with a pencil or pen to writing on a computer or tablet, right? When we're composing something, like we're writing a school paper or an essay, and they're not the same, right? So a computer affords us to do certain things, write in a certain way. Writing on a piece of paper affords us to write in a certain, I don't just mean physically, I mean the process of thinking things through as you write, let's say. So it seems to me that technologies like a tablet, for writing at least, affords us to do things that writing in a way that handwriting just couldn't, but the opposite is true as well. So now you think of the other things tablets can do, like what we're doing now. Look, here I'm sitting, I don't know how many miles away in a different continent, talking to you over a space of, thousands of miles. Well, that is a kind of affordance. And so it does, it allows certain things to be done and invites certain ways of acting, or certain ways of moving. Now, maybe, Joe, what you're thinking of is there something unsubstitutable about actual hands manipulating things? And I think that's probably true, that physical activity, let's say physical play, rough and tumble play, kids going outside and playing actively, little games that they make up for themselves. The physicalness of the hand manipulation, the physicalness of the play, does certain things, has certain, is unsubstitutable with playing that same sort of game on a tablet, or just looking at your phone and scrolling through it, right? So I think the physical side, we have to remember that we're embodied creatures, and so being embodied means that we have been adapted for certain physical things in our brain development. I think, and those of you who know about brain development, I think recognize the importance of touch, for example, the importance of active interactions, the importance of physical explorations, all of that, in order for brain development to happen in certain ways. So I think that the tablets do and phones do give us certain affordances, but it also, if a kid spends most of their time just, thumbing, that's not good hand exercise, so to speak. And there's other affordances that would be better.
Thanks, Clarence. I am going to sneak my question in. I don't know whether you'll have an opinion on it. I'm thinking of people like me who are very easily frustrated and become very impatient when they're trying to do some manual task or try to learn something. Like, I was looking at the stuff that you were talking about in woodshop and thinking that is just the kind of thing where I'd be like a toddler and I can't do it.
Yeah.
I just wondered whether you had any opinion on why some people are like that, why some aren't, or just how your sort of enactive cognition approach might explain it.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's lots. One of the things, there's lots of possible reasons for that, right? So one of the things I left off, I had in there, and then I left it off because it was way too long. I had a whole section on dynamic systems. So dynamic systems theory, which I'm enamored by. I can understand enough to be enamored by it. I don't understand it enough to sort of get in the weeds of it. But if being able to do something is sort of, as in dynamic systems language, being able to settle into an attractor, right? What it calls an attractor, that it has a stability. So one possible thing is that just general hand use might require much more practice in order to settle into that attractor, which means that the skill is good enough to not be frustrated, right? So that's, to me, might be a developmental thing, might be just a quirk of physiology, might be, right? It could also be like my son, my younger son especially, he has ADHD, right? So his attention to detail gets distracted by other things. And so the exploration isn't linear. It goes here, goes there, goes there. So to stick to a task long enough to make it skillful enough to feel not frustrated with it takes longer. And so it requires him to either get a heightened anxiety, oh, I have to do this, or a heightened interest. And if he's heightened interest in it, then he'll stick to the task longer and get really good at it, right? So it's a combination of things. I think it's not merely just the handiness of it. But having said that, it's in some ways the way that I would approach it is just the same way good teachers approach things, right? You scaffold, you say, okay, the task as it's presented is too complicated, so let's break it into its parts. Or I might, so in the woodshop, these students had no skills, like zero. Most of them had never touched, let's say, a power stapler. So what did we do? We had a bunch of scraps and we set up, okay, now you're going to practice just on this scrap, and they practice stapling, and they practice drilling, screwing, and they practiced, right? So that they felt comfortable with the gun in general, with the stapler in general. They felt comfortable pulling the lever without worrying about the project. Oh, I'm going to ruin it. Oh, now I'm really frustrated because, I've ruined a quality cabinet, so just practicing on scraps, right, was my co-teacher who runs the shop had that as his, he said, let's do that first. Okay, yeah, let's do it, right? So, and then we had a bunch of volunteers who knew how to do these things come alongside and explain. So, and then say, oh, you might not want to do it that way, maybe this way, or let's think it through again, right? So there was coaches along the way, right? So it was a really rich, immersive learning experience for my students. And that, I think, minimized the frustration that might otherwise have set in, going, oh, I don't know how to do this. You're asking, the task is too hard. I'm frustrated now. So I don't know if that answers.
No, it does. It does. It's just, I was looking at, obviously, from a personal point of view. We've gone over time, so we've started to lose. No, it's fine. It was good. You had lots of questions. We've started to lose people, so there aren't that many people here. When I say thank you very much for a very interesting talk. Somebody else has put in the chat that lots to think about. And it has been recorded, and I'll send you a copy so you can share it with whoever you wish to. But yes, I just thank you very much. Very.
Thank you for the invitation. I really appreciated
it. You're welcome. Lots of thank yous in the chat now as well.
Okay, great.
Okay. Well, enjoy.
Yeah.
Did you need to ask anything of me before?
No, I did not. So I'm good to go. So.
Okay. Oh, Jo has just popped her camera on.
Okay. Just want to say thank you, Clarence. Really enjoyed that.
Thanks for orchestrating this, Jo.
No, thanks, and thanks, Rebecca, for hosting.
Yeah,
no problem. It's been great.
Good.
Okay, great. Take care. Speak soon.
Yeah,
okay,
see you soon, everyone.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.